the social world is really different by by the time I hit adulthood versus when they were coming of age, and not just in terms of kind of our so much social and economic change, right? And so the men that we're looking at in our study are kind of what are considered kind of colloquially speaking, late baby boomers, right? So they're
Okay.
coming of age in the 70s and entering the labor market kind of both at a time of great social change, like in the wake of the women's movement, in the wake of the civil rights movement. So there's a broad access granted to groups who, for a very long time, didn't have the same access to employment as white men did. But at the same time that that's happening, we're also seeing kind of really seismic shifts in the labor market. We're seeing the decline of unions. We're
Yeah.
seeing the rise of job precarity. And we're seeing kind of all of these things kind of happening together. And so one of the things that we have looked at in other studies where we're looking at the same group of men is kind of how are some of these factors shaping their ability to find and keep a stable job, right?
So, Sarah, you study economics, social economics, and mental health. What's the link between a men's physical and mental health and their socio-economic status?
That's a really great question. I think the relationship that I particularly look at is the relationship between employment and physical and mental health. And I think we know from a long line of research, of health research, that being employed is related to both your physical and your mental health. And that generally be being employed has positive impact. And we can think of it as kind of having a positive impact for a number of different reasons, right? We can think about kind of being employed gives you greater income, which can be good for your health. It can buy you access to all sorts of services that you might not be able to afford were you not employed. In the US context, being employed is usually how people gain health insurance. This is particularly true for men, right? Women often also find health insurance through their spouses, but for men, being involved in paid work is their primary source of having access to health insurance. The other thing that we know is that it's not just these kind of economic benefits to working that are good for you, but there are also kind of social and emotional benefits too that that working has been linked to kind of lower stress. I have some research that has found that people are reporting lower levels of cortisol which is a stress hormone, when they're at work compared to when they're at home. And we speculate in the paper that this could be because of kind of satisfaction that people feel when they kind of are able to complete a task and do it well, which is a little easier to do at work. And you might feel like you get credit for it. Whereas when you're at home, you're cooking dinner and you have to do it every night, and there's nobody saying like, wow, best dinner every day, right? And no one is ever, I think, saying like, I've never seen the toilet so clean. And so I think that those tasks maybe just you just don't get the same satisfaction from completing them.
Great answer. I think I'm gonna start saying I've never seen a toilet so clean. I'm just gonna start off on
I,
that.
it's
And you
definitely a reasonable, it's definitely a reasonable approach. Appreciate all the labor that's being done.
I also think that I guess it depends on what space you're in, but you get so much, for me, interaction with people. Like you talk to so many people and I get to touch people. I mean, I'm working in healthcare, but I'm just saying like you just get a lot of physical stimulation for me, and you also get a lot of just emotional stimulation. It is the weirdest thing, but when you start going remote, you notice it immediately, almost like immediately that you don't get as much interaction with people. It's definitely contributes a lot to that outside of the freedom with money and doing tasks. So you've done many studies. You've done many studies on the, income or working employment. You did one where you identified groups of different guys based off of their income, like high, low, declining with time. I thought it was super interesting, and upward mobility. And so, I mean, I think we all kind of have an idea of what it's like if you're stably high, you're stably low when it comes to employment. But do you remember those two groups, the upward mobility results and the declining? And the declining one, it was like two different groups. It was a group where they declined in income at different ages. So that I thought was
Mhm.
super cool and important to notice. And then for the upward mobility, it was from like very low status, low income to low income, then low income to medium. What'd you find it with those groups?
Well, I think that I'll take a step back and say that we're really interested in thinking about kind of whether and how men are able to maintain kind of a stable income over their lifetime, and whether it mattered in absolute terms how high your income was, or whether there were benefits to kind of, getting into a job and having the ability to move up. So having this kind of upward mobility that you're just describing, or whether it really mattered to be very low. And so I think that kind of often we think about how income matters in absolute terms, like how much are you making right now and what is the impact of that. But one of the things we were really interested in is like people lose jobs, right? And
Yeah.
then, and after a job loss, they can see kind of a lifetime of lower earnings than they might have expected before that job loss. And some people can get into a job that has a really clear promotion pipeline, right? And so they can have these opportunities for like pretty significant income growth. And so what are the benefits of that? And what we find in this paper that we thought was really interesting is, I think the kind of thing that we would expect to find, right, is that the people who have pretty high incomes are much better off than the people who have really low income,
Yeah. Yeah.
who have kind of stably high and stably low. But the other kind of interesting thing is that the people who have this upward mobility, they end up kind of having relatively similar health by middle age as the people with high income, even though they start out at a really different place, right? So it means that it's taking them a pretty long time to achieve that income growth. So we thought that that was really significant, because it suggested the importance of kind of having this upward trajectory relative to other men. And the other thing that I think is really important is that the people who have this downward mobility have really poor health. So kind of losing kind of experiencing a downward shock, in which you were earning relatively more, and by the time you're close to 50 you're earning quite a bit less, and are worse off than many of your peers at that stage, that was really harmful for your health. And so one of the implications that we kind of argue in the paper is that we live in a society in which scholars have for a long time argued that men's ability to be the breadwinner in the family has been a really important thing. And that kind of we argue that our research points to kind of the loss of breadwinner status, of kind of being a man who's making a relatively good income that probably could support a family, to being one who is no longer able to do that. It seems to have really disastrous consequences for physical and mental health. And so that I think one of the things that we really think then needs to be explored is kind of why that happens, right? So we don't just want to know like that this, I think we kind of show these trends, but I think we also want to think about like, is there for men of having this pressure of being these earners, right? And I think that a lot of times we talk about kind of inequalities at work and at home as kind of being bad for women. And we
Yeah.
don't really think about how much pressure these expectations put on men and how bad it can be for them when they're not able to meet these expectations.
Wow. Yeah. Very well said. So, okay, sorry. Some of them I kind of asked in the same way. So you guys wrote about kind of like career fluidity or upward mobility in work. And did you guys ever look at creative and challenging work impact for well-being versus like stagnant, mundane, non-creative kind of work?
Oh, that's interesting. No, we haven't. We haven't
Okay.
looked at that in our research.
So you guys write about external constraints to a guy's future career trajectory. What are some of the constraints to finding a job, a good job, or
And so this is actually something we've explored in a number of different papers. And we have a paper that came out last year that's looking at the same cohort of men using the same data, actually. And so when I say cohort, I mean a group of men who were born within a relatively short time period from one another, so that they likely, and the way I would describe it is, I was born in the late 1970s. So someone who was born around when I was would experience life quite a bit differently than my parents who were born in the
yeah,
40s, right? That so that you that the social world is really different by by the time I hit adulthood versus when they were coming of age, and not just in terms of kind of our so much social and economic change, right? And so the men that we're looking at in our study are kind of what are considered kind of colloquially speaking, late baby boomers, right? So they're
okay,
coming of age in the 70s and entering the labor market kind of both at a time of great social change, like in the wake of the women's movement, in the wake of the civil rights movement. So there's a broad access granted to groups who, for a very long time, didn't have the same access to employment as as white men did. But at the same time that that's happening, we're also seeing kind of really seismic shifts in the labor market. We're seeing the decline of unions. We're
yeah,
seeing the rise of job precarity. And we're seeing kind of all of these things kind of happening together. So one of the things that we have looked at in other studies where we're looking at the same group of men is kind of how are some of these factors shaping their ability to find and keep a stable job, right? Because it's not, I think that we tend to think of finding and keeping steady work as the thing that men do, right? That we ask women, and I know we talked a little bit about how I've done research on women's work as well, but we ask whether women are going to choose whether or not to work. But we don't ask this question about men. We never think about men as kind of having this choice or about whether they face difficulty finding and keeping a job. But this work with Adrienne Freck that we're talking about, and she's my co-author on all of these projects, where we're looking at men's labor force participation over a long period of time from their mid 20s into nearly when they're 50. And what we're finding is that actually finding and keeping steady work starting at age 25 until you're about 50 is actually not even the most common category. It's like a majority. I mean, it's the most common category, but it's not a majority of men. The so there's another so it the less than 50% of men do that. Some men take longer to find that steady work.
okay,
Some men kind of enter steady work and then leave it. And some men experience kind of fluctuations over the life course in terms of their access to steady full-time work. And so I think that's really important for us to think about as I answer that. So this is a long-winded way of answering your first question,
fine,
because I think we want to think about kind of what types of work men have access to, and then why they have different access to it. And so one of the things that we find in our study is that the men who were employed when they were coming of age, so when they were like between the ages of 18 and 25, the men who were employed in jobs that were heavily unionized were more likely to not find steady work. And we see that as really directly being related to the decline in unionization that happens during their coming of age story, right?
Uh,
So they're
yeah.
going into these unionized jobs, and then those jobs are leaving the US, right? And so they're not able to maintain the steady employment that their fathers or their grandfathers might have had access to,
Oh, yeah.
particularly if they were white men. And then another thing that we find is that if you're growing up in an area where rates of unemployment are high,
Yeah.
and particularly as you're entering the labor market, because that time of adulthood when you're transitioning from school into work is a precarious one. It's precarious for many of us, right? It can be hard to
Yeah.
find a job when
Thinking about
we first finish
yeah.
schooling. So if unemployment rates are high in the area that you live in as you're moving into adulthood, it can make it harder for you to find that first job. You might have to compromise in terms of the job. Like you have an ideal job and then you have the job that you actually found. And the job that you actually found might be further down the ladder
Right.
of the job market ladder. If we think of the job market as a ladder, than you hoped it would be if you had graduated at a time when the economy was booming. And so we really find that that matters a lot too.
What about education?
So education is hugely impactful. I think I think one of the things I always like to make sure to say is that it has is that we know that there's differing access to higher education
Yeah.
um
True.
by gender and by racial groups as well. So and we also know that there are different outcomes, right? So the education is maybe um less in some ways more and in some ways less. Like so if you are someone from a historically marginalized group, you may reap a lot of benefits from going to college, many benefits that you would not have had access to otherwise, but you may still not have the same benefits as someone who is not from a historically marginalized group. Right. And so
Right.
in terms of the occupational outcomes that you could enjoy. So education is complicated, but what it does do is in general, when we're looking at the population overall, having access to a higher degree is preventative from ever experiencing unemployment, and it's preventative for risk of experience periods of out of work. And our research kind of distinguishes between kind of the folks who are employed, folks who are unemployed, which we would define as people who are not working but currently seeking work, and people who are out of work, so who are not in the labor market and they are not searching for a job. People can be out of work for a lot of different reasons. They could be a mom who's decided to stay home with their kid. It's much less common, but they could be a dad doing the same thing. Or they could be someone who's going back to school, or they could be a discouraged worker, right? And we know that a lot of workers who can't find work in their area and remain unemployed for a very long portion of time eventually move into this discouraged worker category where they stop looking for work for a while. And many of them then eventually do return to the labor market, but often in not as good jobs as they have been.
Oh, okay. So having education could help a lot with the gaps in employment.
Yeah, it helps a lot. It reduces the likelihood that you're going to experience those gaps, and it reduces the likelihood that you're going to experience unemployment.
So
And
we don't
both
have.
I'm sorry. I say both of which have like kind of long-term implications too, right? So one of the things that, as you maybe picked up on, the way that we think about like thinking about employment is that we don't want to just capture kind of what's happening right now, but we
Yes,
want to also capture like what's happening right now and how does it matter for like 30 years from now?
I love that. You said that or you hinted at the fact that getting employment early in early adulthood seems to matter a lot. It's funny because I've spoken to several researchers and they all kind of say the same thing. I don't
Yeah.
know if you know why. Why is that so important? That because it's so precarious? Is that why that time
Yeah,
period?
this is a great question. I think there are a couple ways to think about it. And the first is actually, I think, maybe a little counterintuitive, which is that unemployment actually in young adulthood is really common. So, um, over half of young adults can expect to experience a bout of unemployment between the ages of 18 and 25. So it's super, super common. And I say that because I think there often still is some stigma attached to being unemployed, right? And so I think it's really helpful for us to recognize how common an experience it is. But the kind of challenge with being unemployed is that that you often it depends a little bit on the unemployment policies at the time, right? But in the US context, um, you often have at most 6 months to find a new job, and the the benefits are not what you're used to, usually making at best half of what you had previously earned. And so, which doesn't go often far enough to allow people to kind of make up that income difference. And so often people go and take jobs that they're less qualified for. And it can create a cycle because they can lose that job too, right? And then it can kind of become the um, cyclical process in which they're kind of finding a job, scrambling for a new one, losing that one as well, and then continuing. So that's one way in which it can be really problematic. And this is particularly true. And so one of the things I would say is that it's actually really important to distinguish between workers who have any bout of unemployment and workers who have a bout of long-term unemployment, right? And so people who've been unemployed for at least 6 months, that is particularly damaging to kind of one's long-term work trajectories and kind of eventual income. But any unemployment bout is often damaging. And you can think about it as kind of having the cyclical loss risk, but also just even if you find another job and you take it and it's a good job, um, it's likely not with your same employer. So you've lost some of that institutional knowledge that you built up, right? Like when you're working at a place and you know what you're doing and you have this experience, so then you have to kind of start again, right? And you have to build all that knowledge again. And it puts you a little behind of where you were before you lost that job. And so we can see how sometimes those little differences in kind of skill acquisition and experience can have long-term payoff implications because you lost your job and you're not allowed to offer to someone who's unemployed less money than you would offer to someone else. It's illegal. But you may end up taking a job at which you have a slight pay cut and also this deficit in terms of now you have to like show your manager that you're a good worker and do all these other things all over again that takes you a little time to establish. And so, whereas in your old job before like the company closed or whatever, you could have kept moving up the ladder and you could have stayed at that same income and then had all that information and experience and familiarity with people. And you might have been in line for a promotion. You're not just kind of taking a step down and making a little bit less money. You're taking a step down, making a little bit less money. And then you don't have those relationships and you don't have that knowledge. So you have to build all that back up before you can take the next step again. So it puts you there. So it's like kind of this way in which you become, it just becomes harder and harder to catch up.
So some of the side effects of there's a lot of consequences for guys who end up not finding work or poorer guys. And some of that includes like drinking and smoking and other things. Can you talk a little bit about that? And then can you speak about the benefits of having a stable job for a highly
Yeah. And I think here, and you're referring to the AJS study with Adrian, I think. Yeah. And so here I think it's really a little difficult to say whether those kind of what we would think of as healthy behaviors are a consequence of kind of poor work, or if they're related to some of the earlier factors like being less educated.
Right.
Because one of the things we know, for example, and I say this as someone who works on a college campus, right, that going to college, the your participation in things like smoking and drinking and doing some other things maybe increases for a little bit during that college period time, but then post college, people who are college educated tend to do less of some of those things, like the heavy drinking and the smoking. It's a really difficult thing to disentangle, right? Like, how much of this is about your education? How much of this is about your employment? But it is very clear that they're tied together, and they're tied together in our study and with implications for men's physical health.
Yeah, and maybe temperament too. Like the type to want to sit through college and do all that stuff is probably different from, you know, someone who wants to use their hands, you know? So it's
Yeah,
hard.
and perhaps I think that might be a good question for someone in psychology. I think
Yeah.
in sociology we might more point to the kind of social structures that would shape those decisions.
Right. Okay, and so and there's a it seems to be a lot of benefits with stability, which we kind of know. Is there any advice you'd give, like maybe not, I don't know, younger people looking for work, what anything to go for or to avoid, or I don't know.
I think that's a really nice question. I think it's a hard question to answer, but I think that one of the things we're starting to see workers think about a lot is kind of um, measuring kind of the importance to them of the ability to kind of have the life that they want, have the income they need to sustain it, and have the and how can they do it in a job that is stable and that provides kind of the benefits that you need. And I think that one of the things that I would always recommend is to think about kind of not just um pay when you're looking at a job, and thinking it also about like what are the what's the job quality going to be like? Is this a job you can sustain? Is this a job that has a job ladder that will let you have those kind of income gains if it's not a job with um, a high income itself? I think also the thing that I would say is that the challenge can be to find a job that lets you do all of that is really challenging these days, right? I think job quality overall has declined for many workers. And so one of the things I would say, and I say to my students, is like, as you're looking for work, it's important to kind of think about kind of the what not what workplaces kind of provide the opportunities that you want, but also the kind of support for the life that you'd like to lead.
Well, thank you.
Of course, it was so nice to talk to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Let's stop this here.